Welcome to Early Returns, hosted by Jan Baran, a partner of Holtzman Vogel. This podcast examines law and politics and seeks insights from political players in elections, lobbying, media, and the law. Now, let's join our host, Jan Baran.
Welcome back to Early Returns, a podcast about law and politics. I'm your host, Jan Baran. Our producer is Jody Mayer Piazza. We're recording this episode on March 23rd, 2026. It's an election year. In 8 months, voters will decide who will sit in the House of Representatives and in 1/3 of the seats in the U.S. Senate. Republicans currently control the Senate by 3 votes and the House by a handful of votes. The elections will be hotly contested and control of Congress is at stake. President Trump has completed his first year of his second term, and what a year it's been. Mass illegal immigration has halted, but deportations are controversial and sometimes violent. The government was shut down entirely last fall, and now TSA, the Transportation Security Agency, is unfunded, producing long lines at airports. Trump imposed tariffs, but the Supreme Court ruled they were illegal. Venezuela's President Maduro was captured and is pending trial in New York. And Iran was bombed last year and now is under military attack by Israel and the U.S., causing enormous disruptions in the Middle East and worldwide with oil shortages and high gas prices. I hesitate to mention the controversy about renaming the Kennedy Center and the demolition of the East Wing in the White House. Joining me to discuss this bizarre election year is political analyst and author Charlie Cook. Charlie was our guest on Early Returns 2 years ago when he pointed out the historically low approval ratings of then-President Biden. At the time, Biden was seen as likely to be reelected, running against his convicted and twice impeached opponent, former President Trump. Charlie's warning was made before Joe Biden's disastrous debate with Donald Trump, and we know what happened after that. Charlie is the founder and publisher of the Cook Political Report, which he started 42 years ago. He also is the co-author of the Almanac of American Politics, which is the authoritative reference book for information about politics and elections in each state and every congressional district. Charlie has observed and analyzed U.S. politics for decades and is a sought-after public speaker and news commentator. Charlie, welcome back, and thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me on, Jan. And I want to clarify, I sold the newsletter 5 years ago, so I'm the former publisher. But anyway, and I still write a column that's once a week that's in National Journal and in the Cook Political Report, and it goes out on Substack every Thursday, Friday. So people can look for Charlie Cook Politics on Charlie Cook Politics Substack. So anyway, that's it. But glad to be on. And I think President Biden, as you remember, Jan, he took a 14-point dive in job approval rating between June and October of 2021, and his numbers never recovered, never went above 45-46% after that. So I don't think he was really politically viable after say November, December of 2021.
Well, of course, he stepped down from the race and was replaced by Kamala Harris. And she had her campaign, which was, I believe, 107 days, whatever is the title of her book. We had not talked since your appearance here about what happened after your commentary about President Biden. Obviously, the turn in the election must have surprised you, as all of us. But what was your prediction once Biden stepped down and Harris became the nominee? Were you surprised at the outcome, or was that something you wrote about and said was a toss-up, or that Trump was still going to make it through?
Well, The transition from Biden to Harris went about as smoothly as you possibly can. And, the funny thing is that I think Biden had become unelectable, but if you technically look at the polls, right, compare after the debate, before the debate, you didn't see that much movement, just a point or two. But what happened was, the race was close before, relatively close before, it was relatively close after. But what happened was the well had become poisoned with the undecided voters, those voters that didn't want to commit to Trump, but they couldn't go with Biden and weren't so sure about Harris. But the well had been so poisoned that I don't think there was any way Biden could possibly get them back. And so the question is just, did having a new candidate reopen the opportunity to get those people back? And I think to a certain extent, no, it wasn't able to. And, in her book, she writes about, well, if only it had more than 106, 107 days. But to be honest, anybody that coming out of that cabinet, any vice president of Biden's, they had practically gone to the courthouses and changed her name to Biden-Harris. It was, so that I don't know that it was actually winnable by the time in retrospect. But, we forget how close that race really was when you look at the New York Times averages in each of the 7 swing states. And we now know, of course, that Trump carried all 7. But in the Times averages of all the major polls in those 7 states, in 6 out of the 7 states, one candidate had 48%, the other had 47%. In 3 of those states, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Harris was at 48 and Trump was at 47. In Georgia, Nevada, and North Carolina, it was Trump at 48 and Harris was at 47. Only in Arizona was that Trump was at 50 and Harris was at 47. So every single one of those states except Arizona was a 1-point margin, in the polling. And in the end, about 2/3 of the undecideds broke to Trump and he swings all 7. But this was one where, a point and a half is not a huge number overall, but it was like across the board in virtually every demographic group, geographic group, there was a slide over, so that, when the country is so evenly divided, fairly small shifts can have enormous consequences. And that's exactly what happened in that election. A 1.5-point loss, which doesn't sound like a whole lot, but when it's enough to do all 7 states, swing states, then that's it.
Well, this is an election year again, and Trump is not on the ballot. But I have the sense that he is going to be part of the voter decision-making. Do you agree with that?
Oh, yeah. I think midterm elections, they're almost always referenda one way or the referenda up or down on the sitting president. It's often, far more often down than up. In fact, the only 2 exceptions since the end of World War II in terms of the party in the White House losing seats in the House of Representatives, which is the best measure of sort of what's going on. The only 2 exceptions were, 98, the Clinton impeachment, and 2002, the election 13 months after 9/11. So in 18 out of 20 midterms, the party in the White House lost seats. If you average all 20 of them, it's an average of 26 seats. And the House, with every district up, same day, everything, with every district up each election year, that's really the best measurement of what's going on. The Senate, though, it's not nearly as clean. It's much more idiosyncratic. When you only have 1/3 of the Senate up every 2 years, it matters which third is up and, the circumstances in each one, and open seats and all these things. So that the Senate, a lot of times it's more driven by, if anything, what happened 6 and 12 years earlier that sort of sets the table for that election in terms of who's got which seats and how close to the edge they are.
And It's probably more difficult to measure the status of an off-year election like this one compared to a presidential election year. I mean, because there it's always a binary choice and it's only one campaign that's being polled by and large. And here, as you suggested, you'd have to follow the polling and all the contested Senate seats and whatever would be the targeted House seats to try and parse things out, which means that you're relying more and more on more local polling, either in the state or in a congressional district, to the extent that there's been polling about these elections that we're going to have in 8 months. Do they exist? Are you reading them? What do they tell you?
Well, first of all, there's very, very little public polling on individual House races. And in terms of publicly available, most of what is there is pretty low quality stuff. Now, the Democratic and Republican campaign committees are looking at very high quality research, and the campaigns are usually looking at very high quality research. But, you only see, 0.5% of all the polling data that these campaigns are pulling in, and you're only seeing what they want you to see. And if it's not favorable, that you sure as heck are never going to see that. But our elections, certainly in the House, our elections have become far more parliamentary now. That's the irony, is that we're approaching the country's 250th birthday, and yet over the last 40, 50 years, our political system has gone much more like Great Britain's than it ever was before, where people are voting red or they're voting blue, and there are really not many exceptions to that. This whole business of 24 red states and 19 blue states and 7 purple swing states, they're almost like impenetrable walls between red America and purple America in the middle, and between purple and blue. And it's astonishing. Every one of the 48 Senate seats in the 24 red states, every single one of them is held by a Republican. 37 out of 38 of the Senate seats in blue states belong to Democrat or held by Democrats. Susan Collins, the only exception. And in the 7 states that are swing states, Democrats have 10 of those seats and Republicans have 14. But, even when you go down to like governors, for example, every red state has a Republican governor except for Kansas and Kentucky. Every blue state has a Democratic governor except for New Hampshire and Vermont. And it goes down the line, Attorney General, Secretary of State, control the state House, control the state Senate. We've gone to a parliamentary system here. And so it narrows down how many places to look, because the other ones, we kind of know who's going to win already.
Well, this is a big change, even from the time you started observing campaigns and commenting on them. When did things change, and why did they change? And how did we get to where we are now?
Well, that's a great question. I think for most of us, certainly everybody over, say, 60, everything you learned in high school or college, political science, government, graduate school, it's practically none of it is applicable anymore in terms of elections. And I think the big change was 1994. But, it used to be that we had 2 broad-based parties. Both were pretty ideologically and geographically broad-based, diverse. You had conservative Democrats that were moderating influences in the Democratic Party, and you had liberal Republicans that were moderating influences in their party, and you had lots of moderates in both sides, and the parties overlapped a good bit. And it's ironic that in 1955, the American Political Science Association had a task force that wrote a report about the parties that complained that the parties were not ideologically coherent, and that voters weren't getting a real contrast between the two. And ironically, what the political scientists identified as a weakness in our system was actually the thing that made us the most stable democracy in the Western world. But a little bit in the 80s, but certainly in the 90s, and since, conservatives abandoned the Democratic Party, liberals abandoned the Republican Party, moderates in each party, centrists or less ideological folks, have kind of pulled back in both parties. The center of gravity of the Democratic Party has moved far left. The Republican Party moved far right/populist. And each party is narrower than it used to be. In other words, the distance between the most and the least liberal elements of the Democratic Party is much more narrow than it used to be. And the same thing in terms of conservatism or populism in the Republican Party, so that the parties now are polar opposites of each other ideologically. There's no overlap. And that we now have a system where, one party gets in. I mean, we've had 5 consecutive presidents that take the oath of office. Their party has control of the House and the Senate, both. And by the time they leave office, their party has lost the presidency and the House and the Senate. And, each party gets in, screws up, loses one of those elements, then loses the other 2 elements. They're completely out in the wilderness, and then it's the other party's turn to go too far and, repeat. And I think a lot of people don't realize is that while the House, you can kind of figure out the direction, maybe not the degree, but the direction it's going to go in most midterm elections. But in the Senate, the last 4 elections, the House and Senate have gone opposite directions. The party picking up seats in the House lost seats in the Senate in 4 consecutive elections. So people that look at President Trump's job approval ratings, low as they are, averaging around 40, 41, 42 nationally, and they can see the House looks like it's very likely to flip over in the Democratic hands. And so they assume the Senate does, when no, that's not a safe assumption at all. In fact, I'd be fairly surprised if Democrats did win a majority in the Senate in this election, just because they only have good shots at 2, North Carolina and Maine.
Well, one of the distinguishing features of this polarization in politics and parties, to me, is that it seems to be selective geographically, in that really the fight seems to be gaining ground or losing ground by state. So that, for example, in Virginia, where I reside, last November, we had an election for our local legislature where the Democrats overwhelmingly won. And Virginia has been described in the last few years as a purple state that seemed to go back and forth a little bit, but it now seems to be all Democrat. And next to us is the state of West Virginia, which, as I recall, in 1988 voted by a 40-plus percentage points in support of Democrat Michael Dukakis. And in the last election, by a similar margin of over 40 points, voted for Republican Donald Trump. And so you have these localities where things are changing, some of which seems to be fairly long-lasting, and in other places, they seem to be on a teetering point, but might be changing in those states, like North Carolina or Arizona, which you mentioned before. What's the explanation for this geographic development that we've seen?
Yeah, no, it's as recently as you put it, in 1988, West Virginia voted pretty Democratic. But when we started shifting to more identity politics, and you started seeing the Democratic Party sort of skewing, at least in terms of education, upscale, and the Republican Party skewing more downscale, more populist, guns, abortion, social, cultural issues started taking on huge importance, so that now West Virginia is basically among, about one of the most Republican states in the union. And it used to be very, very, very different. Yes, Virginia once was a purple state. It has trended very much Democratic. It's a light blue, I would call it an indigo state. So it's kind of light blue. In fact, actually, the way I would define is Minnesota, New Hampshire, New Jersey, Virginia, New Mexico, or sort of, they're blue states, but they're light blue, the indigo states. And on the other end, Texas and Florida, they're still very much red states, but they're kind of light red, not as light as Democrats would like it to be, but kind of magenta. But those are the states that are sort of just not deeply red or deeply blue. But it's education is now one of the most important variables in how people vote. Ironically, population density of, how urban or, close in suburbs versus rural, small town has become, huge. But politics has just become much more identity driven. But I think in terms of Virginia has become a blue state. Now, in 2021, Republicans with Glenn Youngkin were able to pick it off. But they were able to do it after Biden dropped 14 points in a 4 or 5 month period, timed straight into that November 2021 election, so that, Joe Biden, frankly, cost Democrats the governorship of Virginia. So 2025 comes along, Donald Trump's in office, and you see, to a large extent, a reversion to the mean. That Virginia voted more like it normally does, maybe a little bit more so because Trump was so unpopular that the Democratic gains in the legislature were a little stronger than normal, but it was more of a corrective thing. In 21, Democrats almost lost the New Jersey governorship. In 25, it snapped back and they won it comfortably. So this ebb and flow that we see in partisanship, it makes, in those 7 swing states, it makes all the difference in the world. It makes some difference in light blue and light red states, and doesn't make a whole lot of difference at all in the deeply red and deeply blue states.
Well, one of the other features, besides the geographic distinction of all this polarization, is what I would refer to as what seems to be the disappearance of the independent voter. You remember how we used to talk about independent voters and that they really weren't sure which way they were going to vote? I mean, that was very fashionable back in the 70s, 80s, and really into the 90s. And now we may still have voters who show up in polling data that say, well, I consider myself independent, but they seem to be fewer of them, number one. Number two, the vast majority of self-described independent voters appear to be lying to themselves, if not to the pollster. Is that an accurate description of what's going on with the so-called independent voter?
No, that's exactly right. The number of independents was never quite as high as some polling indicated, primarily because there are lots of people who like to say, I vote the person, not the party. And I think I'm a thinking person. I think for myself. But then about 3/4 of independents, if you ask them one simple question, would you say you lean more towards the Republican Party or do you lean more towards the Democratic Party? 3/4 of them lean one way or the other. And then if you ask them, how do you plan to vote in the upcoming election? Or how did you vote in the last election? And one before that, that 75% of them vote, or actually in the 80s, vote the way they lean, so that the number of actually true independent voters, only about 10%. And in terms of people that actually vote in any given election, it's only about 5%. Or let me do it differently. If you took a Gallup poll of all adults, or any poll of all adults, nationally, you'll get 45% claiming to be independents. Now, if you just do voters, it's going to be closer to a third. But again, of that third, 75% of them lean and could regularly vote one way or the other, but have some deep psychological need to call themselves independents. But functionally speaking, they're partisans. And that's sort of where it came down, in this last election is 5-6% are pure independents. Some of them had aligned one way or the other. So you were down to like the last 3 points of voters, and they didn't like either one of them. And some of them ended up not voting. But, undecided voters rarely split down the middle. They usually break one way or the other. I like to say sooner or later, most undecided voters decide.
Well, that's my experience with friends, and I have several friends I can think of who would describe themselves as, the thinking independent voter. And whenever we would talk about a particular campaign, particularly one that involved a Republican candidate, and they would usually say something like, well, that was a candidate I was thinking of voting for, but here's what they did that made me vote for the other candidate, a Democrat. And every time I have a discussion like that with a friend who has that attitude, I would say, well, in that case, who was the last Republican candidate you voted for?
Bingo. No, that's exactly.
And they can't remember, but they're sure that they did vote for one at some point. And these are people in their 60s and 70s, but they can't remember the last Republican candidate they voted for.
Well, I mean, we lived for, from 1988 until 2021, we lived in Maryland in Montgomery County. And there was a group of people who were Democrats or independents who leaned Democrat, but they would throw a vote for Connie Morello when she was in the House. They would cast a vote for Larry Hogan, but they'd jump in front of a bus before they'd vote for any other Republican other than those two. But those were Republicans that kind of figured out how do you do well in a pretty blue place. I think two fascinating places to me. Take Vermont. In presidential voting, Vermont is the most Democratic state in the Union. And yet, when was the last time the Democrat won the governorship? It may have been, I don't know if it's anybody since Howard Dean, but like Phil Scott, he's been elected, reelected, 4 or 5 consecutive, they have 2-year terms, 4 or 5 consecutive elections. How does that work? Well, he's figured out a recipe that works for a Republican to survive in Vermont. Or even more interesting to me is New Hampshire, which is a blue, but a kind of a light blue state. Presidential, it votes pretty Democratic. And yet you've had Republicans win the governorship, 4 or 5 times in a row. They could have both the House and the Senate, but Democrats, it votes Democratic presidential, and both senators are Democrats right now. I think if there's a sleeper Senate race in the country this year, I think it could well be New Hampshire. It's an open seat, and where if Democrats aren't careful, they could lose that. I mean, that people in New Hampshire know that a Sununu is not a Trump. You can vote for, you like or not like Sununus, but you're not going to mistake one of them for Donald Trump, that's for sure.
Well, and the same could be said in reverse for neighboring state of Maine, which votes overwhelmingly Democratic, except they have a Republican senator who has been reelected several times, but is going to face a challenge this November as well.
Actually, Jan, that's where I live now. We moved up here 5 years ago. And, Maine is a curious state because, it's got 1.4 million people, 2 congressional districts. The first congressional district is Portland and then goes up the coast a good bit. And it's very, very Democratic. But the second congressional district is more inland and up a little. It's real Republican. And it's had a Democratic congressman, a conservative Democrat, Jerry Golden, probably the last relatively conservative Democrat left in the House, and he's not running again. But the key for Collins, and New England had a long history of electing moderate to liberal Republicans. She's the only one that's left. Mm-hmm. But in her, she was elected in 96. So in her reelection, starting in 2002, she never had an opponent who had ever won a statewide race. She had been getting opponents that she and the National Republican Senatorial Committee and the Senate Leadership Fund, the Republican Super PAC. I mean, like we were up here part-time, or we were up here for all of the 2020 campaign. And Sarah Gideon, the Democrat, was the Speaker of the Maine House at the time, outspent Collins by a pretty decent amount of money. And yet they chewed her up and spit her out. Collins won by 8 points, about 8 points, when Biden was winning by about 8 points in that state. But, you kind of, when you get into the kind of the big league, that was a $200 million Senate race, by the way, all spending combined. This one coming up is likely to be in the $300 to $400 million, which that's a hell of a lot of money for 1.4 million people.
Buys a lot of potatoes from Aroostook County in the north side of Maine. This year, of course, Senator Collins is going to be potentially opposed by someone, a Democrat, who has run and been elected statewide, if she can win the primary, which is coming up. So this will be one of the important races to watch. Now, after our discussion of how few independents there really are and how polarized everything is, that brings us to the base of the two parties, the Republicans today and the Democrats today. And my questions for those two entities is, how large do you think is the MAGA base of the Republican Party, which is prevalent in the age of Trump? And for the Democrats, my question is, what are their base now? And what are they doing? Because there's been some discussion here about not only what has happened in the Republican Party in terms of its internal dynamics, but it seems that the Democrats are having their own version of a little turmoil internally in terms of who they are as a party.
Yeah, I think at the risk of oversimplifying that, when you and I grew up, I grew up more, in the deep South and on the Democratic side, but it was a very moderately conservative, business-friendly wing of the party. Your roots are on the Republican side, but not extremely conservative. We almost had four parties, sort of liberal Democrat, not so liberal Democrat, not so conservative Republicans, and really conservative Republicans. But nowadays, the moderately conservative, business-friendly wing of the Democratic Party no longer exists. And I'd say the liberal, fairly moderate wing of the Republican Party effectively no longer resists. And you have people that are sort of loosely aligned to parties, but they're really not very enthusiastic about their parties. But in this era of negative partisanship, which, the dynamic of people who hate the other party even more than they like their own party, and that voting, if they don't like their party's candidate, or if they're not enthusiastic about where their party is right now, voting for the other side is just not an option. They will either just skip over an office in an election, or they just won't vote that year. Mm-hmm. And that has become, because you're seeing, typically 4-5% of Democrats voting Republican in a presidential year, even smaller in a midterm year, and the numbers are basically the same on the Republican side. So defecting, is almost not even an option. It's just you vote with your seat. You stay home if you're not happy with the party. But in terms of your original question, roughly 30% of the country identifies as MAGA. I think we're now actually starting to see a little bit of I don't think there's a civil war in the MAGA side at all, because I think a lot of these people who claim to be voices of the MAGA movement, there's only one voice for the MAGA movement, and that's Donald Trump. And for MAGA Republicans, they love Trump. They trust him. If he changes his mind on an issue, they're going to change right along. Either they will change right along with them, or it won't make any difference. But if you're a Tucker Carlson, or if you're a, what's his name? Used to be Goldman Sachs, one of Trump's early advisors, disheveled all the time. Anyway, they're not speaking. There's only one person that speaks for that movement, and that's Donald Trump. And I think we are seeing a little bit of a delineation between sort of MAGA and America First, with America First being more isolationist, nationalistic. MAGA more cultural identity sort of politics, but it's a very fine line, but there's no meaningful discord publicly anyway about the war in Iraq on the Republican side. I mean, anybody's not happy, they're keeping their mouth shut pretty much, with a handful of exceptions.
And over on the Democratic side, you've got the Social Democrats. What effect do they have within the Democratic Party?
Culture is defining so much, and I think that's one of the reasons why you are seeing this realignment. Where think of the 1940s and 50s, a classic a photograph of what you might say was the heart and soul of the Democratic Party then was the iron workers working on a skyscraper in New York, eating with their lunch, sitting on there eating with their lunch, and now, I don't know, there are probably 8 or 10 in that picture. Maybe one of them's a Democrat now, maybe. That when the Democratic Party started pushing more cultural issues, social cultural issues, it left a bunch of working class people behind. And when the Republican Party started focusing more and more on social, cultural, and less on some of the more traditional economic issues, they started, skewing. I mean, so we've seen a realignment, but with the two parties remaining roughly the same size that they were, but the composition inside. But, the party that nominated, Dwight Eisenhower, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, McCain, Romney, that party doesn't exist anymore. And just as someone with the ideological profile of Bill Clinton or Jimmy Carter could no longer win a Democratic nomination and fly to the moon because that party's changed so much.
Well, I think the photograph of the steel workers or construction workers on the beam eating their lunch would be replaced today in the Democratic Party by a photograph of a university faculty lounge and perhaps their graduate students who go on to great success. I know how dangerous it is to make predictions in an election in general, but particularly one that is so diffused with all these House seats and Senate seats. So I'm not going to ask you to make a prediction necessarily, but kind of, what should people be looking out for as they're trying to decipher what's going on? And of course, we're going to experience unexpected developments over the next 8 months, just as we did when you and I last talked 2 years ago during the presidential election. But what would you tell our listeners they ought to keep an eye on in trying to interpret how this election is unfolding in the next few months?
Well, first, midterm elections don't change direction much during the actual midterm year. They get set in motion, I think, for the most part, during the odd-numbered year leading in. And things can get better for a party or they can get worse for, the end party, but they generally don't reverse directions in the election year of midterms. We kind of know directionally, but maybe not degree where they're going to go. In the House, first of all, I would be flabbergasted if Republicans held on to their majority in the House. I really would. I think when you only have a 3-seat majority, and you have let me split it up this way. You ask nationally, sample of real voters, approve, disapprove of President Trump, and his approve would average about 41%, give or take a point. But to borrow Ross Perot's term, if you look under the hood, what you'd see is the president's approval rating among people who self-identify as Republicans would generally be in the 80s, occasionally top 90. Among people who identify as Democrats would be about 4 or 5%, give or take a point or two. And in the 30s among, independents. Now, red states are places where there are a whole lot of Republicans, obviously, but where, a lot of these places, states, districts, a Republican can win with 0 Democratic votes and maybe even 0 independent votes. They don't need any converts. They can just win with the Republicans. The same thing on the Democratic side in really blue states and districts is they don't need any independents. They don't need Republicans. And in the case of these members, a Republican is constantly looking over their right shoulder because they're in a lot more danger of losing a Republican primary than they are of losing a general election. And the same thing for Democrats looking over their left shoulder. And so these things are sort of baked in, but it's in the handful of states in the middle and a couple dozen states, congressional districts in the middle, that's where all the action is. And in those states, you do have to win a disproportionate number of independents. And in an election where independents are about, midterm with the president's approval ratings in the 30s, I'm sorry, you're going to take a major bath in purple states and districts. God help you if you're a Republican in a blue state or district. And the same thing if it were a Democratic president. And we could talk about 2022 in a minute if you want, but so that I would be flabbergasted if Republicans held on to the House, but the average loss of 26 seats, I'd be surprised if Democrats even got up to the average number. And the reason is that, number one of the things in midterm elections in the House is it's where are you, how fat is your majority? How many districts are you carrying that God didn't necessarily intend for your party to have? And Republicans right now with a 3-seat majority, having lost a couple of seats in the last election, they've got a very skinny majority. They don't have a lot of flab. They don't have a lot of they don't have many districts. In fact, there are only 3 Republicans sitting in, using the lines that were in place in 24, there were only 3 Republicans in the entire House that were in districts that Kamala Harris carried, even by a vote. And so for Republicans can lose basically every seat they've got in blue districts, and they can lose every seat they've got in purple districts and only lose 15 or 20, maybe, seats in the House, maybe 24, 25, max 25. Because at a certain point, they'd have to start losing some places that are really, really, really red. You'd have to be winning votes of people that haven't voted for any Democrats since Moby Dick was a guppy. And if the shoe was on the other foot. Now, people say, well, what about 22 when Joe Biden's approval ratings were in the same ballpark that Trump's are now? That's a good point. You look at the national vote in 2022, and it wasn't that bad for Republicans. People say, oh, it was Dobbs. No, it wasn't Dobbs. It was that overall gross numbers, Republicans didn't do that badly in terms of raw votes around the country. But in about 2025, about roughly 4 or 5 Senate races, 4 or 5 gubernatorial, 4 or 5 AG, 4 or 5 Secretary of State, about 10 House seats, Republicans nominated some candidates where primary voters got a little over their skis and started going with who do I really like as opposed to who could win an election. And they nominated some real nut jobs. There were states and districts that if Republicans had nominated a potted plant, they'd have had a 50-50 chance of winning, but they didn't. There's some danger this year of Democrats nominating. My wife is trying to get me to stop using the term wacko to describe far left or far right candidates. So I go with exotic and potentially problematic. Anytime a party base gets a little too wound up and starts nominating people that can't win swing voters, they buy themselves a lot of trouble. And Jan, you remember well during 2010, Obama's first term midterm election, and in 2012, where Republicans between those two elections, they lost 4 or 5 Senate races that they should have won because they nominated Tea Party people in places that weren't Tea Party states.
I would summarize your overview here as the country is going to remain very narrowly polarized in their attitudes, that Republicans are at a distinct disadvantage and risk of losing the House of Representatives.
But not in the Senate.
And not necessarily the Senate, but the Senate is idiosyncratic.
I know we're probably running too long here, but let me just elaborate a little bit on the Senate. Maine is a blue state, light blue, but blue. If Democrats nominated a candidate who had won statewide, knew what they were doing running statewide, they'd probably win. They nominate somebody that's never run for elective office, never been on a debate stage or something like that. Well, I wrote a column. I said, I asked the question of Maine Democrat, do you feel lucky? Like Clint Eastwood in Dirty Harry, when the guy's about to reach for a gun. Do I have one vote left in my chamber or not? In North Carolina, it's a purple state, and Roy Cooper, I think, probably would have a real advantage there. So those are 2 places where Democrats ought to be able to win. Now, at the same time, in Georgia, that's a purple state where John Ossoff's up, very hotly contested, but he's looking a little better than I would have suspected. Michigan, I think, is going to be a hell of an open seat, going to be a heck of a race. But for Democrats to get, let's say Democrats didn't lose a single one of their own seats in the Senate. If they win Maine, they go from 47 to 48. If they win North Carolina, they go from 48 to 49. And then 51, that means going someplace real red. And Alaska or Florida or Iowa or Texas or Nebraska, those are really, really, really hard. And that's actually kind of the part of the problem that Democrats have is that there are only 7 swing states. They already have 10 of those seats. They've got 2 this time. They're only 2 up next time. Well, they've got 2. Well, one blue, one purple, or the Republican-held seat, and then they've got a North Carolina and a Wisconsin with Ron Johnson and Ted Budd in North Carolina up in 2028. And the last other Republican in a purple state is Dave McCormick, and he's not even up till 2032. 2032. 30. It's 30, I mean. Democrats have no margin for error here. And my guess is they'll pick up, I think they'll have a net gain of a seat or 2 in the Senate. But above 2, 3, maybe. But I'm still...
Well, it's going to be close, and it's going to be an interesting election. We are going to monitor that ourselves. And for our listeners, one thing I would ask of you is, in addition to the Cook political report, what should listeners be following to try and figure out what's going on in this election? You mentioned your Substack.
Yeah, which is free. I mean, I get paid plenty for that column in the first 72 hours after it comes out before I can put it up in the public domain. So it's out there for free, Charlie Cook Politics Substack. But, I think the best piece of advice I would offer people is stay the hell off of cable. That I get a kick out of people that watch, I watch, 5 hours or so a week of Fox and 5 hours of MSNBC because I want to hear both sides. And, I say, what? The average of crazy and crazy is still crazy. I mean, you're not splitting the difference. You're just hearing a lot of crazy stuff there. I wouldn't partake of any news outlet that more than 60% of the viewers or readers are aligned with one party.
Well, that's good advice, as always.
Well, this is so much fun. I'm sorry to be so long-winded, Jan, but...
No, not at all. Not at all. I mean...
Cold winter months are now barely spring, looking out across the hills in Maine. It's fun to talk to someone like you, Jan.
It's my pleasure. And by the way, out here in Virginia, it was 85 degrees yesterday. So we were actually feeling like summer as opposed to spring. But I remember what winters are like in Maine, having been there myself. Charlie, thank you so much for being here and for your insights, as always. And I also would like to thank our producer, Jody Mayer-Piazza, and to our sponsors as well, the Holtzman Vogel Law Firm. Thank you for your support of this program. And I remind our listeners that any opinions that are expressed here are those of the host, and that's me and our guests, and do not necessarily reflect the views of our sponsors or their clients. By the way, all of our episodes are available on Buzzsprout as well as many other podcast platforms such as Spotify, as well as the National Law Review. I hope you will check them out. Thank you for listening, and join us on the next edition of Early Returns. Have a good day, everybody.
Take care.
Thanks for joining Early Returns, Law and Politics with Jan Baran. We hope you will join us for future episodes, which will continue to bring you voices and insights from the people engaged in our political landscape.